Welcome to a decade that redefined movies as we know them. An era where concepts were high and the budgets were higher. A time when technology allowed for the full reinvention of genres. A period when action heroes evolved, blockbusters nearly collapsed, and a revolution began in the shadows of Hollywood. This was the 90s. This was the end of the century. By the end of the 1970s, the story of American cinema had become dominated by scale. Bigger movies, bigger budgets, bigger risks. But away from the center of the industry, a different story was beginning to unfold. Not in studios, not in boardrooms, not in summer release schedules, but in classrooms, in college towns, in rep theaters, and later in video stores. These were not just alternative spaces. They were alternative circuits of discovery. Whilst Hollywood was building upward, something else was forming underneath it. This is a story of how indie cinema didn't disappear, it reorganized. As the decade ended, the revolution that had defined New Hollywood was already running out of road. What had begun as a rebellious backlash against the old studio system had, over the course of a decade, produced a generation of filmmakers and stars who wanted more than just freedom on set. They wanted ownership, control, autonomy from studio oversight. The result was a wave of director and star-led production companies designed to formalize filmmaker control and artistic latitude. Francis Ford Coppola, Peter Bogdanovich, and William Friedkin formed the Directors' Company in partnership with Paramount. The idea was simple. Give elite filmmakers the power to choose their own projects and work with minimal studio interference. At the same time, actors attempted a similar experiment. First Artists was founded by Paul Newman, Barbra Streisand, and Sidney Poitier, later joined by Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman. Their goal was to reverse the traditional power structure, allowing stars to develop and produce movies on their own terms, with Warner Brothers and Columbia acting as distribution partners rather than cultural gatekeepers. On paper, it looked like the future. In practice, it exposed a deeper problem. Artistic freedom, on its own, was not a long-term strategy that could make the arrangement last. What these structures offered was leverage inside the system, but not freedom from the system itself. The Directors' Company collapsed within just a few years after being formed. Internal conflicts undermined cohesion. Bogdanovich and Friedkin clashed over projects. Friedkin prioritized developing The Exorcist elsewhere, leaving the partnership fractured. And films like Daisy Miller failed to perform, draining confidence and capital. First Artists lasted longer, but ran into similar structural limits. Whilst hits like The Getaway and A Star is Born proved the setup could work occasionally, flops like Pocket Money eroded studio patience. The company never gained enough leverage over marketing and distribution to sustain its own pipeline. In fact, access to capital was never truly a problem for either entity. Neither was artistic prerogative. What they lacked was a direct channel to audiences. They were still dependent on the studios for access to screens, market reach, and national and international visibility. Independence existed on the production side. Reach still belonged to the studios. At the same time, auto access was becoming unmanageable, expensive, and increasingly difficult for studios to justify. The late 1970s and early 1980s brought a series of cautionary tales. Heaven's Gate and One from the Heart weren't just commercial disappointments. They became psychological events inside Hollywood. Proof that unrestrained autonomy could expose studios to catastrophic financial risk. They didn't just lose money. They changed the emotional climate in which green lights were given. Studios felt the need to reassert control. This retreat from autonomy didn't happen in isolation. After all, this period was also marked by corporate reconsolidation in Hollywood. Major studios were absorbed into larger conglomerates. Coca-Cola acquired Columbia Pictures, Gulf and Western restructured Paramount. Studios became divisions inside multinational corporations, governed less by individual artistic judgment and more by quarterly performance, risk management, and brand strategy. In that environment, filmmaker-led independence wasn't just risky, it was structurally out of step with how Hollywood was now owned and operated. The lesson studios took from these events was not that bold filmmaking was dangerous, it was that autonomy without discipline was. As the 1980s began, independent filmmakers found themselves in a strange position. The fresh ideas that had defined a generation didn't disappear, but the industry structures that had supported them did. New Hollywood didn't end for lack of talent. It ended because the version of independence it relied on couldn't be scaled. As the rules shifted, the filmmakers and rising stars of the past didn't disappear. They were either absorbed into the new order or pushed underground. Over the course of the next decade, while studios consolidated around sequels, high-concept vehicles, and global blockbusters, an alternative ecosystem began to quietly rebuild the conditions for independent cinema, not through one institution, but through a network. And at the center of that network was the Sundance Institute. Founded in 1981 by Robert Redford, Sundance began as a talent incubator, a place where independent filmmakers could develop projects, refine scripts, and find mentorship outside the studio system. By the mid-1980s, it had taken over an existing Utah Film Festival and rebranded it as the Sundance Film Festival. Sundance was designed to protect creative voices. It quickly became something more complicated. As both the Institute and the festival grew, they began to attract the attention of the majors. Agents, distributors, and executives started to treat Sundance not just as a cultural event, but as a marketplace. Projects were no longer simply discovered, they were shaped, positioned, and increasingly acquired. The tension was built in from the start. Sundance wanted to nurture independence, buyers wanted to package it, scripts were refined, concepts were adjusted. What began as an incubator gradually evolved into a filtering mechanism where independent films were prepared for wider commercial life. Redford's creation never set out to replace the studios. However, it evolved into a bridge between independence and the industry. But development alone was not enough. At the same time, a new class of existing distributors began to occupy the space the studios had abandoned. These companies were not prestigious at first. In fact, many were associated with exploitation, cult cinema, and low-budget genre fare. New Line Cinema, which had been around since the late 1960s, had built its reputation on midnight movies and transgressive material, distributing films by John Waters and leaning into counterculture rather than awards prestige. Miramax, founded by Harvey and Bob Weinstein in 1979, began by distributing small, often controversial, or foreign films in the United States. One of its earliest productions was the slasher film The Burning, hardly a prestige calling card. These companies didn't enter the market as art cinema evangelists. They grew into that role because the economics pushed them there. During the 1980s, European filmmaking underwent its own transformation. Shrinking domestic markets and limited access to capital forced European filmmakers to work with smaller budgets whilst retaining strong authorial voices. Miramax recognized an opportunity. Rather than competing with Hollywood, it focused on counter-programming, importing European films that looked and felt nothing like studio product movies that could be positioned as sophisticated, adult, and culturally distinct. Miramax wasn't just distributing films. It was learning how to sell difference. Alongside Miramax and New Line, companies like the Samuel Goldwyn Company played a quieter but important role. Goldwyn specialized in upscale independent and foreign films. Titles like Gregory's Girl and Stranger Than Paradise helped bridge the gap between art house and mainstream audiences. Goldwyn's strategy was selective rather than aggressive. It focused on prestige and careful positioning rather than dominating festivals or award circuits. In many ways, Goldwyn represented a transitional phase, proof that independent films could reach wider audiences even if the infrastructure to scale them wasn't fully built yet. Together, these companies rebuilt the supply side of independent cinema, but circulation was only part of the story. Indies also needed recognition. By the mid 1980s, even the awards ecosystem had started to recognize this parallel film culture. The Independent Feature Project, launched in 1979, grew from a loose support network into a bi-coastal community that treated low-budget work as a category worth organizing around. Out of its West Coast branch came the Findy Awards in 1984, a small shoestring ceremony that celebrated films too fragile for traditional prizes. Those findies quickly evolved into the Independent Spirit Awards. The trophies got more polish, but the signal stayed the same. There was now a public stage for movies that existed outside studio logic. The spirits didn't legitimize indie film so much as acknowledged that a distinct ecosystem already existed and deserved to be seen. Recognition mattered. The Independent Spirit Award provided it. But films still needed physical places to live, and audiences needed places to encounter them. Across the United States, a specialized exhibition circuit expanded. Arthouse cinemas, college town theaters, urban specialty screens in cities like New York, LA, Austin, San Francisco, and Chicago. These weren't blockbuster venues. They were cultural institutions. These theaters screened films, but more importantly, they curated them. Programming was built around seasons, themes, and filmmaker retrospectives. In many cities, these cinemas became community hubs, places audiences returned to not just for individual titles, but for a sense of belonging to a film culture outside studio cycles. They gave independent films time to find their viewers. Longer runs, the ability to build word of mouth, repeat attendance, a way of building viewership that did not depend on national advertising campaigns. Indie cinema survived because people kept making films and because there were still places willing to show them. By the mid to late 1980s, something else began to change: audiences. European films began finding a receptive home in the United States. A Room with a View became a surprise success, grossing $21 million domestically on a $3 million budget and earning 8 Academy Award nominations. Proof that European imports could crack mainstream America. Wim Wenders' Paris, Texas offered a version of America filtered through an outsider's lens, connecting with audiences in ways studio films increasingly didn't. These titles weren't just exotic, they were personal, not spectacular. Observational, not explosive. Character-driven, not effects-driven. The same audiences renting these titles on VHS at Blockbuster were discovering Godard, Dario Argento, and John Woo from the next shelf over. By 1987, Americans rented 400 million videos annually. For the first time, a kind of global cinema literacy could develop in suburbia. Domestic independent films still carried a niche stigma. With a few major exceptions, such as Spike Lee's She's Gotta Have It and David Lynch's Blue Velvet, they were often treated as the domain of critics, cinephiles, and small intellectual audiences. But the audience for them was being trained in plain sight, and by the decade's end, tastes had truly shifted. Technology continued to accelerate the process. By 1989, video rentals accounted for 12% of studio revenue. The rise of home video didn't just change how movies were consumed, it changed how film culture was learned. A new generation of filmmakers grew up not in film schools but in video stores. Names like Paul Thomas Anderson, Robert Rodriguez, Kevin Smith, Wes Anderson, and Quentin Tarantino, the so-called VHS generation. They watched everything, rewinding obsessively, memorizing Kagemusha tracking shots alongside the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Video stores became cultural engines. They flattened hierarchies. Hong Kong action set next to European art house. Comedies set next to Italian giallo. Tastes became less inherited, more assembled. Independent video shops curated foreign films, cult titles, and underground hits. Staff picks guided taste. Discovery became part of the experience. But this wasn't just education for filmmakers, it was education for audiences. Viewers learned to seek out smaller films, stranger titles, movies that didn't look like Hollywood. A parallel taste culture was forming, and by the end of the decade, that culture was ready for something to crystallize it. That moment arrived in January 1989. A young filmmaker by the name of Steven Soderbergh brought his debut feature, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, to Sundance. The film was small, intimate, focused on relationships, sexuality, and emotional alienation. It felt like a rejection of 1980s excess, tapping into a cultural mood that was beginning to turn inward. The film won the Audience Award at Sundance. Then it won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. Miramax acquired it and put it into wide release. The result was seismic. Sex, Lies, and Videotape grossed $25 million on a $1.2 million budget. It wasn't just a hit. It was a blueprint, a festival discovery, a critical darling, and a commercial success, all routed through a single boutique distributor. More important than the numbers was the signals the movie's success sent. Sundance became visible. Miramax became credible. Independent film became legible to the industry. Prestige became a form of leverage. Festivals, critics, and awards created a feedback loop. Small films could become cultural events, not through spectacle, but through attention. At the same time, the broader culture was shifting. The Cold War was ending. The triumphalism of the Reagan era was giving way to something more reflective. Audiences were open to quieter stories, stranger voices, titles that didn't rely on scale. Studios facing rising production and marketing costs were also looking for alternatives. High-profile prestige failures like Bonfire of Vanities and Havana made executives wary of expensive adult dramas that couldn't guarantee returns. Independent films suddenly looked attractive, not because it was artistically pure, but because it was cheaper, more flexible, and capable of generating prestige at a fraction of the cost. By 1990, independent cinema had rebuilt everything New Hollywood once had: creative freedom, cultural relevance, an audience. What it didn't yet have was ownership of its own pipeline. For the first time in over a decade, the major studios weren't just watching from afar. They were paying attention. That attention would change everything.